Hey, Troy, just FYI, we can't hear you if you're talking.
So at each one of these sites, there's 10 years, or there's 10 dendrometers. And this is where our photospec instrument can also focus the tower spectroscopy. This is what some of the data looks like at the needle scale. So I'll orient you with these figures on the right here. So at the needle scale, just at the left side here is the fall transition. At Delta Junction, we have far red SIF relative from the tower and just normalized steady state fluorescence in blue from the MONIPAM. You can see this extremely tight correspondence, which we're excited about. And the MONIPAM is continuing to run, so we'll capture the spring transition here this spring. Then on the bottom panel here, we just have FB over FM plotted against light use efficiency of photosynthesis. The panels over here are xanthophyll cycle pigments. So these are photoprotective pigments that regulate energy dissipation in the needles, and we can use remote sensing proxies to get at that. So you can see this strong seasonality in xanthophyll deepoxidation state at the top, total xanthophyll cycles in the middle, and then also we observe pretty much no change in chlorophyll concentration throughout the year. So this is our instrument. This is a figure from one of Zoe's papers, and this is photospec. And these instruments are scanning spectrometers, so we can focus on individual species in a small field of view at each one of these canopies, and we get retrievals like every couple minutes, but we typically average over a 30-minute, or we can focus on specific species. Zoe has 2 nice papers out from this system at Southern Old Black Spruce, and then we're working on some papers right now with the Delta Junction data. I'd recommend going to see Zoe's poster for more on this, but this is a cool figure she made where we were just basically looking at diurnal profiles every month of, on the top there, far red SIF, and then NDVI, NIRV, CCI, and air temperature on the bottom with GPP in black. This is also on my poster if you want to go talk about it later. The sort of main take-home message is that we see sort of a light response of SIF in the spring prior to any increase in GPP. And I think we can explain that for a number of reasons, which are on Zoe's poster and my poster. And I think time is moving. We also looked at a lot of the CFIS data, which was collected in 2017, which was the fluorescence, chlorophyll fluorescence imaging spectrometer. And one of the big questions Erica Orkrat's working on right now is how does the flux footprint variability impact the airborne remote sensing pixels? And so she's doing footprint modeling at, I think, like 20 different towers in the Arctic boreal domain, and then averaging CFIS and ABRIS pixels within these footprints to see how well they correspond to GPP. Among other things, the take-home message is interpreting any instantaneous remote sensing signal that is meant to interpret plant function from a single flyover is really difficult. And especially comparing that to a half-hourly flux. And so we've been working with this data for like 2 years, and it's really hard to get anything super interesting out of the CFIS data because of this really instantaneous nature of the flyover and this really dynamic signal, which is why this year, at least with the ABRIS data, we're pushing for more diurnal cycles because we think we can learn a lot more about the dynamics of these data over time. And then Ray Chang, I think she gave a talk yesterday and has a poster online. She's at Caltech. She's focusing on the satellite aspect. We're mostly working with Tropomi data for this. for the SIF data, which we're using the single sounding retrievals at a 3 to 7 kilometer resolution. And again, Ray talked about this a bit yesterday, but one thing we're looking at is basically the Max Planck Institute GPP product compared to SIF, and looking at how the slope varies across different ecosystems. The take-home message is basically that for ecosystems with taller canopies, we see a higher slope in the GPP-SIF ratio, which is important then for extrapolating SIF inferred GPP across the domain. And then we also are comparing it to some tower data here as well, which Ray talked about. And yeah, I'm out of time, but this is again a figure from the proposal, and we're trying to connect all these scales. And I think with the 1 year no cost extension and probably beyond that, we're going to learn a lot more things. But we have a nice like 2 plus 3 year ground-based data set to work with. So thank you. I don't know. We can skip me for questions, and you can find me at my poster later because I took too much time, and I'm sorry about that. Okay, next up we have, where's the schedule?
I'm up next.
Oh, you are. Yeah, I guess if you're up next, maybe just. Oh, right. Yeah. Sorry.
No problem. Can you see the?
Oh, good. Good. I acted like I knew what I was doing, but I don't.
Do you have to share? Resume share?
Let's try to reshare. Oh yeah, you know, I've been doing this Zoom thing wrong. Okay, here we go.
Okay, great. So my name is Chris Nye. I'm a research scientist at NASA Goddard. And this speed talk is kind of a summary of our 2016 to 2020 carbon cycle science project. Some highlights associated to the structured data that we've extracted throughout the circumboreal forest. So the overall objectives of this project are shown here. But the major deliverables thus far is production of a stand history forest age map throughout the circumboreal forest, used all of the available Landsat data from 1984 through 2020. Here we state 1972, but unfortunately we couldn't process MSS data in time to complete that objective. We're combining that with high-res commercial stereo data throughout the domain. And we're doing space for time substitution to estimate site index. And then we're combining all that information into LPJ, a dynamic global vegetation model. So in this talk, I'm really just focusing on our deliverables. Here is an example of for maps from our 84 to 2020 maps. All of this was done in AWS, 224,000 images. I really wanted to present the details of this result, but this paper has been in flux. Now it's at Nature Climate Change. So hopefully I'll be able to present the detailed results of this analysis in the future. But the data is viewable through this link right here, TerraPulse, where it has forest gain loss, forest age, and annual tree canopy cover. So we've combined that data with, I think it was over 7,000 strip pairs throughout North America and Eurasia. And this talk, we've also added ISAT and ISAT-2 data to do space for time analysis. We use the NASA Ames stereo pipeline to process these data using SGN, semi-global batching to produce digital surface models. This just shows the distribution of some of those stereo pairs. I did want to mention, I don't have time to get into the details about these various publications, but the modeling aspects of the study were covered in these top 2 publications. The second one actually implemented the age integration of stand age within LPJ. So it's been primed for the stand age information from Landsat data, but unfortunately, we weren't able to complete that in this study, but we are working on that on a future study. The other aspects and the lower publications, one of the major results of extracting canopy height information from stereo imagery is the ability to have a high resolution digital train model. So we've developed an approach to extract a DTM from the high res stereo data by filtering the optical point cloud, and that's covered in that presentation in the middle. Jordan, who's here, has a publication where we're using CNNs to mask clouds out of imagery. So we reduce the possibility of having false retrievals. And then these two lower publications, which are in prep and ready to submit to RSC, we've been doing discrete anisotropy radio transfer modeling to get a better understanding of viewing conditions and the impacts to the DSM retrieval over vegetation, meaning convergence angle, solar azimuth angle, all those impacts can change your estimated height from stereo imagery. So moving back into the space for time substitution approach, we applied 15 different forest growth models to IceSat, IceSat2, and all of the stereo pairs with the stand age information to build growth curves. Okay. Very close to my last slide, so if I just have a minute more. So this is the distribution of all of the growth curves. In this example, there's 1,575 site index curves throughout the North America domain, colored by type. So blue is IceSat1, red is IceSat2, VHR is all the orange points, and some examples of these growth curves. So the x-axis is age, the y-axis is height. That was World V1. World V1 again in a different domain. So you can see how it asymptotes early at 4 meters. IceSat and IceSat2. So the takeaway points, this is, to my knowledge, the largest known vegetation growth comparison between stereo VHR and spaceborne LiDAR. The space for time approach appears to be robust for estimating site index. And in general, the VHR stereo underestimates growth in dense tall stands due to our ability to extract a DTM to then estimate a canopy height model. And what we're still working on, these wall-to-wall estimates of site index really need to be integrated into next generation models to account for stand disturbance recovery dynamics. That's it. All the publications associated with this project. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe check out the poster for questions for Chris. Okay, next up we have Angela, who is online. And now that I've got this dialed in, okay, if you could just tell me when to go to the next slide.
Oh, sure thing. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So hi, I'm happy to be joining remotely. My name is Angela Erb, and I'm a postdoc in Crystal Shops Group at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And we are developing or have developed a Landsat and Sentinel-2 albedo product. And we were funded through NASA Look to develop the HLS Landsat and Sentinel albedo product across the circumpolar domain. So you can go to the next slide. So because Landsat and Sentinel-2 don't have any angular information, we use MODIS and VIIRS to generate the BRDF. And we have a matching algorithm in which we do an unsupervised classification on the Landsat image and look for pure pixels within those classification images. And then we pull the MODIS or VIIRS BRDF into the Landsat and apply albedo to nadir ratio calculation correction to generate 30-meter Landsat with 20 meters Sentinel-2 albedo products. So this is built upon the theoretical basis that over pure homogeneous areas, the ratio of albedo to near nadir reflectance at MODIS and Landsat spatial resolutions is comparable. We've, next slide. Thank you. We've spent a lot of time validating this data because it is kind of tricky to work in some of these high resolution or high latitude regions. So just looking at 26 tower sites across the circumpolar, we looked at snow and snow-free scenes and used Landsat blue sky albedo generated from MODIS AOD to validate the data at the tower sites. And we feel pretty good about the results with the RMSE of less than 0.05. And that's just an animation of 2018 of the Landsat albedo throughout the year. You go to the next slide. So some of the things that we're looking at with this data is kind of capturing albedo seasonality, and again looking at that critical shoulder season that we've all been hearing so much about this in the last couple of days. So on the left-hand side of the image, you have a animation of a tundra site in Siberia, and you can really see the pink and orange is the higher albedos, and the blue is the darker albedos. So you can really capture the delineation between snowmelt across different land covers, with the river bed in the southern part of the scene and the thermokarst lakes in the northern part of the scene, and the land cover across some of the old lake beds in the center part too as well. So being able to kind of pull out the albedo drivers of some of these land cover changes is exciting for us. Looking more at some more water bodies on the right-hand side of the slide, we have this is in Canada, and it's a subset across tundra and boreal in the circumpolar, looking at the impact of water body size on the albedo signal. So if you look at the distribution on the top right there, you can see that red line is a MODIS pixel. So almost all of the water bodies within that rectangle there are smaller than a MODIS pixel. And they have a pretty strong impact on the albedo signal and the drivers of the seasonality of albedo. And if you look at the bottom there, it's just a quick comparison of the albedo as a function of lake size as compared to the average albedo for all non-riverine water bodies in the area. And you can see this little flip-flop where you have the larger lakes hanging on to their snow and maintaining a higher albedo later in the spring, and then tending to develop or gather snow later in the fall. So the kind of the balance between the albedo size and the water body size and the albedo signal, and what happens as we're starting to see shifts in some of the size distributions of these lakes across the broader domain. So we're excited to see kind of the radiative forcing effects of that. Next slide, please. We've also looked at some fire scars and fire dynamics. This is in boreal fires in central Canada in 2015. And what you're seeing on the left there is the average daily forcing. So the radiative forcing as a result of albedo change from the fires from 3 years post-fire. And this is in the period of January, February, March, and April. We're seeing the greatest albedo change, again, with these, the high emphasis on the shoulder season. And if you look at the forcing across the year on these, annual plots on the right there, you can see that the summer and fall and winter have a very minimal effect, and it really is the spring forcing that's going to be most critical in assessing the radiative impacts of some of these fires across a longer scale. Next slide, please. And what we're able to do with this higher resolution data, because we know these patterns, right? We see them in the MODIS data, we see them in a lot of the data, but identifying the drivers more specifically is something that this higher resolution spatial and temporal data allows us to do. So looking at nuances in the land cover change and the impact of those changes on the radiative forcing across these systems. So this is looking at pre-fire and the cumulative forcing throughout the year of the impact. So you see that again, these were the greatest in the center there, the greatest slope in the shoulder season, and then it levels out in the spring, or excuse me, in the summer and the fall in terms of differences in forcing pre-fire and post-fire land cover types. And again, also looking at some of the burn severity data on the right-hand side there. So this is just like a quick overview of some of the things that we're looking to do with this product, and we're really excited about working with people. If there's any interest, we'd love to kind of hear more from people, so please reach out. And next slide. I think it's just if anybody has any questions, happy to answer them offline. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. We're gonna have to keep it going, but if you do have a question for Angela, you could log into the Zoom and maybe message her or reach out to her here. Awesome, thank you. Next up is Margaret. Yeah.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Is there a microphone?
Use the one there
This right here?
for the mic, yeah.
Hello. Hello.
Better.
Okay. Hi, my name's Maggie. I'm going to be following up on some work that Chris presented earlier on our project estimating site index in the circumpolar boreal using stereo and LiDAR. So just to reiterate some background, site index is an important factor in global vegetation modeling and carbon modeling. The widespread availability of the stereo data presents an opportunity for us to map site index over broad domains such as the circumpolar boreal. But the growth curves in site index from airborne LiDAR are needed in order to validate the estimates from the stereo-derived canopy models. And so that's what I'm setting out to look at right now. Just brief overview, Chris already touched on this, but we're modeling growth curves using the Landsat disturbance data and canopy height estimations. And that's just a figure right there showing, an example of the growth curve that Chris just presented, and stand age is on the x-axis derived from Landsat data, and then canopy height represents the y-axis. So we used a space for time substitution approach and aggregated the data over sites with similar characteristics. And then from those growth models, estimated site index at year 50, and the results from the site index at year 50 from different sources can be compared as a means of validation. So again, Chris touched on this earlier. We're getting canopy height from stereo. We did a lot of work looking at different sets of parameters to optimize the stereo process. We landed on using the semi-global matching correlation algorithm. So the SGM processing uses much smaller kernels than the typical block matching algorithm from AIM stereo pipeline. And so we found that these results were smoother than the typical algorithm, and also yielded better results in terms of a lower NMAD and RMSE when compared to G-Lite canopy height models. So we processed thousands of stereo pairs over the boreal through this stereogrammetry routine on the NASA Center for Climate Simulations Discover High Performance Computing Cluster. And we produced the digital terrain models and digital surface models using a per pixel filtering approach. For the terrain, we landed on using the 10-meter search radius per pixel, pinpointing the minimum value. And for surface was a 2-meter search radius to calculate surface. And then the canopy height model is a difference between the two. And so you can see from this graph the results of that analysis looking at different parameters. And then you can also see a picture of the Discover cluster that we use to process. And then in the bottom right is a is an example output from the worldview stereo process overlaid with a panchromatic image, and that was over Siberia. So in order to calculate growth curves from clusters, there was a PCA was used to produce the site cluster map. And then we aggregated the structure and stand age data to produce the growth curves for each site or ecoregion. And that the map right there shows the different locations of the different ecoregions that are going to be seen in the next slide. So here's just a comparison of the site index at year 50 between Elvis and stereo. In the black rectangles, you can see the SI 50 output from stereo at the 5th, 50th, and 95th height percentile. And I don't know if you can see, but there it shows in the right side, those are the different rows representing the different height percentiles. And then below each SI 50 estimate from stereo is the growth curves from Elvis, in addition to site index from Elvis. And then you'll also notice that areas, ecoregions that had a low number of samples are highlighted in red. And this was anything less than or equal to 3 samples is shown in red. So the green circles are representing a difference of less than 1 meter between Elvis and stereo-derived site index. And you can see there's a lot of agreement, especially in the 50th percentile of heights, less than a meter. And then the orange is a difference of 1 to 3 meters. Again, a lot of agreement in that 50th percentile. And the brown color is a difference of 3 to 5 meters. And then the red are areas that had a greater than 5 meter difference between site index at year 50 from Elvis and stereo. So originally had set out to calculate growth curves from Elvis and G-Lite as a means of validating the stereo results. However, just due to G-Lite's small footprint, I wasn't able to get a robust trend for growth from G-Lite quite yet. So that's why we're just presenting Elvis here. But site index is attainable using this approach, using disturbance history and height estimates. And the growth models in the site index from the stereogrammetry results, they have decent agreement with those from Elvis across a variety of boreal ecoregions. And these are some references. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we'll just do all the questions at the end if we have time. And if there's time, I'll prioritize the questions for people on Zoom, and then those that are in person can find these individuals out in the halls. Okay, Yaman is up next.
Can you hear me well? Can you hear me well? Okay. So I'm Yanlan Liu. I am an assistant professor at The Ohio State University. Today, I'll be presenting our recent work on shrub expansion and its controls. This work was done with my collaborators at Berkeley Lab, and it's funded as part of NG Arctic project. So over the recent decades, we're seeing very extensive shrub expansion. Just as examples, the left 2 figures show 2 photos taken at the same place on the north slope. They show the new shrub establishment beside the river after 54 years. And the same thing happens across a large area. This is the new shrub area established between 1984 to 2014, detected from the annual land cover data set derived by John Wan and other co-authors. So because shrub expansion has very extensive impacts on carbon cycle and climate feedback, so the key question here is what factors control Arctic shrub expansion? So to answer this question, we first pulled together climatic and topographic conditions and tried to use standard species distribution models to see how environmentally suitable a given location is for shrub. And it turns out that back in the 1980s, when the climate was relatively stable, we are seeing that the shrub cover basically followed the pattern of suitability. If we take a closer look, the most important variables explaining shrub distribution include degree days above 5 degrees C, elevation, and precipitation as snow. Then show you what the spatial patterns look like, we can see that the hotspots of high shrub coverage on the left correspond well with the high values of suitability on the right. As the climate warmed up, we can see lots of areas had higher environmental suitability in 2014 because of warming. But the spatial pattern of suitability does not correspond well with the new shrub establishment pattern. So we can see in some locations where the suitability is high, but then the new shrub areas still remain low. In other words, although suitability had been increasing over the recent decades, shrub expansion did not follow suitability or suitability change. So there must be something else that is limiting shrub expansion. Because shrub expansion originates from seed dispersal, we estimated both short and long distance seed dispersal using this dispersal kernel. It measures spatial proximity to existing shrub patches. This figure shows a general pattern of seed arrival probability, but briefly speaking, areas closer to existing shrublands are more likely to receive seeds. Then we estimated how sensitive shrub expansion is to this kind of seed arrival probability. And this is what the y-axis in the A panel shows. It turns out that shrub expansion is actually 7 times more sensitive to short distance dispersal than to suitability itself. And you can see that if we consider suitability and dispersal, the correspondence between estimated new shrub area and observed shrub area actually got improved from the R equals 2.35 to 0.6. Then if we further compare the areas affected by fire and not affected by fire, we see that on average, more shrub establishment was observed in areas disturbed by fire, shown by the red colors. And in the meantime, fire also enhanced the sensitivity to dispersal. That means areas that are close to existing shrub patches and are disturbed by fire are those places that are most likely to experience shrub expansion. So to sum up, dispersal and fire explained observed shrub expansion over 1984 to 2014. Considering all these impacts, we estimate that about 25% of the Arctic tundra will be shrubified by the end of this century. If we do not account for the impacts of dispersal and fire, we will likely to overestimate shrub expansion and therefore the corresponding carbon sink. So future work needs to better account for the impact of seed dispersal and fire vegetation interaction in order to better predict shrub expansion. With that, thank you for your attention. I have a poster number 10. Please come stop by and we can discuss more in details. Thank you. Next is Amanda. Oh, yeah. Okay. This one? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Armstrong, and I'm here today just to present some highlights from a phase 2 research project that was entitled Predicting the Magnitude, Variability, and Rate of Change at the Intersection of Arctic and Boreal Ecosystem. So our project sought to combine a variety of remote sensing products with a high resolution, spatially explicit individual-based forest model to try to understand and hopefully eventually predict drivers of change at the tundra taiga ecotone, so within the boreal and across the above domain. See if I can get this little thing to show up. All right, so this is just a student interpretation of what the model does. And if you look at the bottom of the panel, I guess it doesn't show it very well on here, but you can see permafrost below ground. So permafrost is one of the key features that we have added as a module in the model. The model automates input of environmental data, covariates for soil, climate, and atmosphere. It also initializes local scale in environmental inputs. So we use a high resolution DEM to sort of underpin our runs. And so we also have recently added litter fall, nitrogen dynamics, and fire as well. So I'll try to summarize some quick, some updates that we've done over the past few years to help us try to understand, how can we simulate and predict patterns of change in both structure and function at the TTE when we're dealing with such a broad and heterogeneous domain. So panel A shows the sites that we've used. These are our inventory sites that are gathered from a variety of different sources, including the National Forest Inventory data from the Canadians. It's also shown on Paul Montesano's tree line abruptness map, which I know we've shown a lot when we give presentations on this project. And that map has been really helpful to help us site select areas that are right at the TTE. And so using the NFI data, we were able to calculate regional allometries. And that's what we're showing in panel B. C shows a test that we did that was a latitudinal gradient, which shows pretty good agreement across latitudes. This was a latitudinal transect of sites that were right at the TTE. And as you can see, if you compare biomass density across these sites, we do a fairly good job with a little bit of variance with one of the shrub species. So we're simulating trees and shrubs as well. Panel D also shows some key updates that we made over the past few months, where we've expanded our run sites from, starting with this model, we were starting with 1 hectare. Now we're capable of running 3 kilometer grids. And these are at 10 meter resolution DEM pixels and individual trees and shrubs. The other thing that we've also done is started to stratify our runs. So using the Sentinel-2 Worldview land cover class product, we're now able to run in areas where basically we can stratify our runs so that we can run it and areas that shouldn't grow trees, like concrete and in the middle of a river, aren't going to grow trees, and areas that might be able to grow them in the future can passively establish and grow trees. So that's also been very helpful. So here's just a couple of examples of the output that we're getting. So we spin the model up from bare ground using statistical climate data, and then starting in 1980, we're running it with MERA-2 climate data, and then we project forward up to the year 2100 with CMIP-6 data. These 3 panels are showing output from a run that is in the Brooks range. And so 1980, 2020, and 2060 are what we're showing in those 3 panels. And you can see when we use this stratified run technique, I don't know why it did that automatically. You can see how we're able to grow in these areas. And what we show is that we are showing areas where we're greatly increasing the number of stems and biomass, as well as some just distribution of species are creeping up upslope. Here's another example of a Seward site. And this is a great example that kind of shows how we're able to capture the dynamics that occur with north-facing slopes versus south-facing slopes. So here we have a valley bottom. And as you can see over time, especially with climate change, we're showing a more rapid expansion up the south-facing slope than up the north-facing slope, and also higher stem densities as well. And the valley bottom has some greater shrub expansion. So I just want to highlight again, this is oops, it went back. Our fun little animation. This is a student that was working on trying to animate. So this is actually a run that we gave her the output run, and she was able to kind of characterize what it looks like. So that's what the time clicker is showing at the top, 1810 to 2010, and the permafrost was the actual active layer depths at the bottom. And you can see how when a fire comes in, the active layer depth gets drastically increases. But I wanted to just acknowledge that we had over 17 undergraduate students that did spin-off projects that were part of this phase 2 project. And also wanted to acknowledge Elise Heffernan, who has been our graduate student, who has done a tremendous job guiding a lot of these students and helping them sort of craft projects that kind of help us sort of understand the system better. So just a quick example of 3 of the different students that we had working this semester. We had one that was doing soils and moisture content, another that was looking at temperature stress testing with our RCP estimates, and then finally another one who was looking at precipitation and temperature changes across the above domain. So to summarize, we spent this project enhancing a spatially explicit individual base gap model, which is Cyborg TTE, to run with input derived from multi-scale gridded products. We validated our simulations of forest and structure and composition for a lot of our focal sites with a really nice inventory data set. And then we've been using this to build a database of simulations where we can statistically examine the variation and change at these sites and try to tease out some patterns of change and help us with, predictions in the future of changes at the tundra taiga ecotone. Thank you.
Next, we have Kathleen, which is a virtual presentation.
Yeah, can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, are you gonna pull up the presentation on your end or should I screen share here?
Yeah, I will share the screen and you could just let me know when you want the next one.
Great, sounds good. Okay, yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. My name's Katie Orendal. I'm a PhD student at Northern Arizona University. And today I'd like to chat with y'all about some work I've been doing mapping plant functional type biomass across Alaska and Northwest Canada. So next slide, please. So there's been obviously a lot of great work that's been done in this realm of vegetation mapping in the past across the above domain. So we've got land cover maps, plant functional type and species cover maps, and even some maps of shrub and total plant biomass. Next slide, please. So what we were interested in doing here was sort of taking a next step and mapping live above ground biomass, but doing it partitioned by plant functional type. So this is just a map of locations where we collected data to support this project, and we collected field biomass harvest data and also UAV imagery. Next slide, please. And then just go ahead and hit it again if you would. Yeah, okay, so just the very basics of the methods, just in the interest of time, our modeling approach was basically a generalized linear model with Lassa regularization. So for predictors, we're using a whole suite of predictors, including seasonal spectral predictors derived from the CCDC algorithm, as well as plant cover predictions produced by Matt McCander. And for training data, we're actually using that field biomass harvest data and UAV derived predictions of biomass. We're using them separately because we were interested in sort of comparing the performance. I'm not actually going to talk about that today, but feel free to ask questions if you're interested. And then finally, just using a Monte Carlo approach to propagate error and uncertainty. Next slide, please. So I'll just buzz real quick through the maps that we produced just to give a visual here, but here's the shrubs, deciduous, evergreen shrubs. Next slide, please. Forbs and graminoids. Next slide. Lichens. Next slide. And so we used a variety of methods to sort of validate our results. Here I'm showing basically an internal leave one site out cross validation. And basically the takeaway message here is that the plant functional types that we were able to predict best, perhaps unsurprisingly, were deciduous shrubs and graminoids. Next slide, please. So we were also interested in using these maps to sort of look at the spatial distribution of plant functional type biomass across our study area. So this is just showing biomass density for different plant functional types within different land cover types. So as an example, you can see that deciduous shrub biomass is highest in tall shrub vegetation communities, whereas graminoid biomass is highest in tussock tundra and herbaceous land cover types. Next slide, please. And we were also interested in looking at how plant functional type biomass has changed over our study period and over our study area. So we charted plant functional type biomass across our study period from 1985 to 2020. And what we found is that in line with sort of trends of Arctic greening and shrub expansion, deciduous shrub and evergreen shrub biomass increased over the study period. Forb biomass increased, and then graminoid and lichen biomass actually decreased. Next slide, please. And finally, we were interested in looking at the impacts of fire. So fire was a really important driver of change across our study period and study area. So what I'm showing here is sort of a time series of plant functional type biomass change in relation to fires. So that red vertical line there is the year that a fire occurred. I'm highlighting in color the 2004 fire year, and then there's some additional fire years in gray for comparison. But basically what we see is that the year after a fire, deciduous shrubs, evergreen shrubs, and lichens tend to decline rather sharply, but graminoids and forbs actually tend to increase. So that's, generally in line with patterns of vegetation succession following fires. Next slide. So just to summarize, for our work here, we found that we were best able to predict deciduous shrub and graminoid biomass of all other PFTs. We found that deciduous shrubs, evergreen shrubs, and forbs increased over the study period, whereas graminoids and lichens decreased. And we found that fires were an impactful and important driver of change in this study. And next slide. And yep, that should be it.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. Next up is Roman.
All right, thanks. I don't have a lot of results. I'm just going to sort of talk about the data that we collected. And Russell Wong is a master's student of mine, and I collaborated with Chris Potter here, who is at NASA, and he provided this MODIS data that I'm going to compare our field data with. And so pixel walking, let me see if I can get this to work. Pixel walking was motivated, Chris, in the year of COVID 2020, I had a bunch of students who didn't have any work that summer. And so I hired them to go out in the field with me, and Chris asked me to go look at some places in the Chugach that he thought were browning. And so we started stumbling around in the bushes trying to figure out how to get field data. And we came up with this idea of pixel walking, and this is there's a MODIS grid, and underneath of it is a transect that we walked, and we collected data using our smartphones to record where we are and when the vegetation changes from one type to another. And what I was really interested in this talk here is how much greening in the Arctic, Northwest Arctic, is more growth versus community change. So anyway, I gotta watch my time. Anyway, the idea is we walk along and we record every time the vegetation, either in the overstory or the understory, changes in one of three ways. So it can change in its cover. And here I have only open and closed cover, but we also use sparse. But in the data I'm going to show you, we shifted everything up, so we didn't use the sparse data. And then we also look at what I call plant structural type, which is basically how tall the vegetation is that we're walking through. And I'll describe that in a minute. We have 6 plant structural types. And then we record the taxonomic group, and we have about 25 of those. So there's a lot of combinations. And again, we just use our phones, we record our GPS track, and then we have a little data sheet on our phone. So we started in 2020 where we stumbled around in the Central Brooks Range to kind of figure out what we were doing. And then in 2021, I got some money from, I used some of my NSF money, I got some NASA money, and I got some money from the Explorers Club. And we went about, I don't know, I guess about 900 miles in 2 months across the Western Brooks Range. And the blue lines are where we pack rafted down rivers, and the red lines are where we walked along and collected this data. And I want to talk about, I want to compare 2 areas, one up in the DeLong Mountains and then one in sort of the upper Noatak Basin. And the data that we're using is this MODIS tin data. You probably all know what that is. And then the greening areas are where that, I don't know how to say that, Thielsen, the p-value of the slope from 2000 to 2018 with this tin was bigger than 0.05. And so here's the upper Noatak. We're about 21% of the pixels we walked across. And by the way, we walked across, we collected 1,200 kilometers of transects, and we walked across 3,000 MODIS pixels. And we have about 800 community types in total, where the community types are defined by their overstory and their understory. But I'm only going to talk about these plant structural types. And I've got 6 trees that are, single stems bigger than 1.4, shrubs that are about chest high, shrubs that are sort of between knee and chest high, shrubs that are kind of between ankle and knee, and then shrubs that are below the ankle. That's kind of how we do it. And so, kind of squishy data compared to what everybody else shows, I guess. But one of the things that I want to call attention to here is in the upper Noatak, where it's not really greening that much. These bar graphs sort of show on the red, I guess that's on your left also, those are pixels that are not greening, or not really, yeah, they're pixels that are not greening, and on the right are pixels that are greening. And then the percentages is the percentage of the transects that we walked across. And what I want to call attention to is the symmetry between the two. So that's kind of like saying that everything is greening at random. It doesn't matter what kind of plant structural type you're looking at, it's kind of going to green or not green, kind of with equal probability. And the understory is also symmetric. And but when you go to a place where it's really greening a lot, like the DeLong Mountains, which are up in the far northwest corner of Alaska, where look, it's like 52% greening, then there's an asymmetry between the greening plant structural types and the non-greening plant structural types, as you can see in the upper, and that's the overstory. But the understory, again, is symmetric. So anyway, this is just sort of an example of what we're doing with the data. I came here these 2 days, mostly because I'm looking for other people who are interested in these data, because it's a big data set, kind of a unique data set. And I think it's the kind of thing that people who do remote sensing would find valuable. And I think it'd be neat to compare it to remote sensing data. So anyway, these are my very preliminary thoughts that greening is an overstory phenomenon, but that's kind of an obvious statement. And then secondly, that extensive greening is not random across plant structural types. I've got a poster, it's poster number 47, it's out there, I'd be happy to talk to you. And I have made some assumptions using this sort of open versus closed to sort of come to the conclusion that maybe about 50% of the greening in this Northwest Arctic is due to like your lawn getting taller, but not getting any dandelions. It's not really changing. Whereas another 50% of this greening is where your lawn, it's getting taller, but the dandelions are poking out, and it's a real qualitative change. So that's my talk. Do I have any time left?
Do you have time left?
One, okay. Okay. Oh, well, I don't use it to call my wife. I'm using the cell phone as I put on airplane mode. It gets a good GPS satellite signal because we're not walking in the woods. It works great as a GNS, and I just charge it up with batteries. It works great. It's like it's a super data logger. I mean, it's awesome. It's like a Swiss Army knife, except for the 21st century. It does everything. I measure tree heights with it too. It's got LiDAR on it.
Thank you. Next up is Jing Hu.
Hello. Okay. Hi, my name is Jin. I'm a PhD student at UCI. I've joined Jim Randerson's group last year, and I've been working with John Wong, Claudia, and Jim on looking at the increases in photosynthesis caused by changes in post-fire plant composition in interior Alaska and boreal forests. So the kind of the objectives of the study were to quantify SIF as a function of post-fire stand age in North American boreal forest ecosystems. So we look at the fire stance, and then we calculate we calculate the SIF coming from it. And then we want to then obtain our second objective, which is to model SIF as a function of post-fire changes in plant functional type and how they change through succession, and how that change in plant functional type affects the SIF signal, and try to relate that to SIF by the stand age. And so if we can model the explained observed patterns in the SIF stand age with the SIF by plant functional type, then we can determine that SIF is plant distribution is a dominant signal in the stand age relationship with SIF. And so kind of the methods that we are using is we're using OCO2 SIF to get within the fire perimeters, and then we're using fire perimeters from the Alaska Large Fire Database and the Canadian National Fire Database. And to get our plant functional types, we're using the Arctic boreal, the above land cover produced by John Wong. And then we're using level 2 ecoregions. And so this is, if you look at the figure here on the right, you can see an example of like what SIF of a single fire. So there's the 2012 Zama complex fire from the National Fire Database, and then an OCO2 track from 2015. And you can see within, outside of the fire scar, there's a little higher SIF signal, and inside this fire scar, the SIF signal is a little lower. And if you look below that, you can see that before the fire in 2011, you can see the evergreen fraction is a little higher. And then in the 2012 evergreen fraction drops after the fire happens. And you can see that persists through. And so kind of the, using that technique, we kind of expanded up to the regional scale, the ecoregion scale, and we can see how plant functional type is changing after a fire. So kind of similar to was a person, I forget their name, Kathleen was showing with their data set. Like you can see that pre-fire, there's a lot of evergreen fractions, evergreen forests, and the shrubs and deciduous forests are lower. And then after the fire, you can see that the recovery is mostly dominated by shrubs and deciduous forests. And then we then kind of like show that the deciduous plant functional types show a higher solar induced fluorescence signal. So using the OCO2 and then like the land cover product, we show that if you look here, the light green line is the deciduous forest, and that the midsummer signal is much higher than what we see with like the evergreen forest and the shrubs. And then the herbaceous and sparse vegetation also have pretty interesting signals, and it'd be interesting to talk to some folks about that. Yeah, and then going from there, we can show that the younger stand ages, which are composed of plant functional types that have higher midsummer SIFs, so like we were seeing in the first land cover fraction change over time, we could see that those stand ages that are composed of like more shrubs and deciduous forests have higher SIF signals. So if you look here, pre-fire, it was mostly like the evergreens. And then afterwards, like, and if you see, yeah, so if you see the kind of the gradients, the yellow, orange, the SIF signal starts to keep getting higher as we kind of go through time. And so the conclusions that we come up with is that the Landsat plant functional data enables a quantitative assessment of post-fire changes in plant functional type composition. Shrubs and deciduous forests are dominant in intermediate stand age classes at a regional scale. Midsummer SIF is elevated after fires, indicating higher levels of photosynthesis that extend beyond 60 years. The trajectories of the midsummer SIF need to be further explored. And also, so kind of like overall, the big picture is that fire changes plant composition, which in turn can change continental scale CO2 fluxes, which is really cool to see, like all the different working groups and like how we can start combining these data and to see the changes in the above domain. I like to thank the NSF and NASA grants that have supported this work, and these are some references. So my poster is 29, it's by the door. Happy to chat more with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jing. Our last presentation will be a virtual one.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. If you could just let me know you want the next slide.
Great, thanks. And I think this might be a slightly outdated version of the presentation, so apologies. But my name is Peter Nelson, and apologies I couldn't be there in person. I'm at the Schoodic Institute at the Acadia National Park, and today I'm joined by a co-author.
I'm Kenneth Bundy from the University of Maine, work as a software engineer there.
And we're going to tell you about some software we wrote that we've been working on for some time called LecoSpector, which is an online package or an R package for processing instrument data from these two spectrometers. Next slide. So we're just going to go over some definitions, talk about our data, look at some results and some next steps, because we've been working on this for some time. And so we're not going to talk about a lot of the background of the instruments. Next. So LecoSpector is the R package of LecoSpec, which we had to call it something, which is the laboratory of ecological spectroscopy. And really it's people, hardware, and code for mapping plants many places, and in this case, Alaska. And it leverages ground scans with one spectrometer with airborne spectrometry data from the UAV that I showed earlier. And in R, we have machine learning pipelines that create plant maps. But we've had some challenges that we didn't really anticipate, as many of us do. And those include things like the variability of the spectral signatures within PFTs really drives what you can map and model and map, the taxonomic resolution of the groups of PFTs you use, the model accuracy itself being determined by those two things, and then of course having different numbers of samples per PFT. And we really also realized that the labeled data we had for validation on the ground was not sufficiently standardized. So those are some things we're going to tell you about briefly today. Next slide. So the data, we have about 1,300 ground scans from spectrometers that cover the bandpass from 350 to 2,500 nanometers. Most of it is collected, was collected in the green dots that you can see here in Alaska under Avarice, which are the red lines here, and the data plotted here are just grouped by different plant functional types with the sample size in the header to show that there's a range of different samples, both in terms of the number and the variability within each group. So variable groups spectrally, and challenges that we want to map these plants across the above domain using Avarice. Next slide. So an example data set, we flew these and operated these instruments under Avarice as coincident in time and space as we could. And here's an example data cube. We have the validation data on the ground, which are 1 square meter estimates of percent cover by plant functional type that an observer reads later based on a photograph we're going to show you. And then we train a model based on the ground spectra to point at this image to estimate the presence of a particular plant functional type in each pixel. Next slide. And it looks something like this. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that the plant functional types that we've arrived at over here that are present in this image have been massaged to match some of the things that we worked on in the spectral imaging working group to try to standardize some of these groups and really use those that are mutually exclusive as well as ecologically informative. And from here, Ken's going to pass. I'm going to pass the talk to Ken, and he's going to talk about some of the work that he's done. Next slide.
Here we can see some of those example quadrats, the validation images. So on the left, you can see the photograph that we were talking about. In the center, we have the plant cover estimates using from the machine learning algorithm. And on the right, we can see a comparison of the human generated percent cover and the machine learning generated percent cover. So as hopefully if we can see it's easiest to see in this case, using the bar graph at the left, I think, that these seem to line up pretty well. There you have a pretty similar lineup between the machine learning predictions and the human predictions with an out of bag error of about little over 3%. So that's a pretty good accuracy. And comparing the images, you can see that they seem to line up fairly well as well. If you advance to the next slide. However, some times things don't go as well. Here we can see that the machine learning and human predictions don't line up as well. There are the machine learning model significantly seems to underpredict abiotic material, for example, compared to the human predictions, predicting much more lichen than we actually see in the image. We're running out of time, so next slide, please. Here we can see some numerical validation statistics. On the left, we have a chi-square test comparing whether the distribution of the human pixels and the machine learning derived pixel cover values are the same. And we have a confusion matrix on the right. And again, we have about a 3% error. So overall, relatively accurate. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it back to Peter.
So one of the main things Ken has helped do is make a code pipeline that we can actually deploy in a Docker or Singularity container like at Adapt, which is what we hope to do with Mark Carroll's assistance. But we do need more data and more scans for more targets, as always. And the goal here is to incorporate under Avarice so that we can fractional cover estimation. We can do fractional cover estimation by PFD in Avarice across the study domain. And we would like to improve the pipeline with other various things, but we don't have time to talk about those. Last slide. Thanks to all of those who have funded this work over the years, and thanks to all of you who have attended today, and would take any questions either offline or now.
Thank you. Thank you for all the speakers. We have around 4 minutes till the end of the session. So if any of the audience have any questions, please raise your hand. Oh, on Zoom.
I did make a message on Zoom.
Oh, okay. Any questions for any of those talks?
This is for Troy, I guess. It goes back to the beginning. When you compared with CFIS data, I mean, well, there's two things. I thought CFIS actually did some loops around and got some time series, perhaps not at that site. That's one thing.
There's like 2 sites where there's like 2 flights.
Okay. And second, I mean, the point of doing those flights was not to get temporal series, but to get a spatial snapshot. And is there anything the spatial aspect of it could tell you, or?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I think you can learn some things from it, but it's again difficult to interpret. Andy McGuire, yeah, Andy McGuire had a paper published this last year looking at the spatial convergence and divergence of the CFIS-SIF data and different reflectance indices from Avarice, and what that showed is fairly like strong covariation between SIF and NIRV, but it varied by ecosystem. Again, but it is so dependent on the time that CFIS flew and the sun conditions and the time of year and the time of day. And so I think that the best way like we can come up with for like normalizing this SIF data is to divide it by the reflected radiance within the retrieval window to get a relative SIF, which can kind of approximate a steady state fluorescence yield, which should be relatively flat throughout the day. And that seems to match decently well with like GPP max, which would be like light saturated GPP over the course of a week. So that's kind of the best way we could come up with to sort of deal with this instantaneous nature of the signal. Chip? I'm done.
Hey, this is Chip Miller. This is for Kathleen. We had some discussion this morning about wildlife and forage, and it seems like the above ground biomass quantification that you've already done directly addresses some of the questions that were being brought up, for instance, about fractional lichen cover rather than just what is the largest fraction of cover. Is there any plan to expand your analysis to either the entire above domain or across the Pan-Arctic?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. And yeah, I agree. I think it could be useful for wildlife. In fact, I plan to go into that realm myself. It could be relatively easily expanded to the above domain. The problem is I guess the main limitation I'll say is the availability of the training data that it's based on. So we can certainly expand it across the above domain, with the caveat that the field data that sort of drives the modeling is constrained to the sort of the area that I showed. So yes, with a caveat, I guess is what I'd say to that.
Okay, maybe one more question.
Yeah, this question for Jean. I'm curious about the underlying reason for the different SIF for different stand age groups. Do you think it's more because of a structural change or just the functional change? No, the change of function types and the change of the SIF. What the reason of change of SIF?
Sorry. So certain vegetation types like have higher photosynthesis rates. And so if SIF is correlated with GPP at like a canopy scale, then we would assume that those, when you have like more deciduous or shrubs that have higher photosynthesis rates, you should also see SIF go up. And so that's kind of what we're seeing. And so yeah, I need to, but it'd be fun to explore and know more, like maybe with different more plant functional types to kind of see, parse out this signal a little more. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. We run out of time. So let's take a 15-minute break. Is that right?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Sorry, I showed up late there. It's a little chaotic. Yeah. Yeah, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Great
Yeah.
talk, by the way.
Yeah, it felt a little chaotic. Here was much more.
So you work on a lot of safe stuff?
Yeah, a lot of like spectroscopy of vegetation. Yeah.
Is that the direction you're going to continue working on?
Yeah. We'll keep doing that. Yeah, we build a lot of instruments. Yeah. So, all right.
Should we just?
Yeah. Yeah. And delta function. Yeah.
Are you all going to be out there doing any work on those things?
We want to try to, yeah. You guys would probably be making similar measurements to what we would be doing.
What I'm asking is, would you be willing to collect oil samples?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So we don't have any plans to go to Vegetation this time. There'll be plenty of people in the area and everything. I'm going to go do everything I can in the first 3 days. Ship the ground meeting was like 2 hours. Yeah, okay. Okay, okay. So anything, the long and short of it is, like, I'll get herbs, but like in 3 days, with olive trees like that, there's only so much I can do. And if there's a way, like, even if you just collect like 4 samples, that's like.
We can collect a lot. I mean, we're gonna, so we'll have our tower instrument running, and then we're gonna collect like needle spectra throughout the day as well. And the diurnal signal, so we could couple that spectra with your samples. Yeah, absolutely. We can send you, so maybe we should talk more about it, but we can send you samples for your analyses, and then I also want to run these PLC for like samples and other pigments. So I'll be collecting needles and put them on drives. So yeah, you can.
Okay, so the great thing about that is like we don't have to, because we do HPLC on some stuff.
Yeah.
We don't have to, we don't want to.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna be doing HPLC, I mean, I don't, I mean, you're probably gonna be sampling right when they're on. Like, I just don't trust the ability to actually accurately many pigments. I mean, because we'll sample a week before, a week after, like, you know, both carotenoids and chlorophylls were fine. Xanthophylls, I guess both. Yeah, xanthophylls, I mean, both xanthophylls.
We'll be getting like the whole suite of pigments, and so we'll get anything you're interested in.
We can do whatever we want. Yeah, so we. That would be absolutely.
Yeah, that would be
Great.
useful for us too, because we can use your. No, I'm not worried about it.
Yeah, we're now just trying to get as much data in as many places as possible.
Cool. Yeah, I'm gonna try to coordinate with them when they're gonna fly, and then we'll send us up there.
So, and I won't necessarily be there when they fly, like my schedule's already set. I already know when I'm supposed to be there. It's just because I'm hitting like maybe 6 different spots every 3 weeks. It's just like we have a lot in all the dates. That is really, that is going to be so awesome.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No.
Which towers that
These. Yeah, our main instrument is at the Southern Yeah. I think we're
So I tried to talk to people, see this data, and I used to see this data, and early years, people were like, no, we got that covered. We're not looking at that. And then I talked to people, it's like, we're done with CFIS. CFIS are not useful. I wish they would.